Alrighty, we're going to get started in about 5 minutes. So everybody get ready to go.
You doing okay? What you got with your literature? Yeah, all right. All right. You got them over there, huh?
Here's some drink. The drinks are not cold. Well, a couple of them are. How about that? It was that cold.
Yeah.
About 2 minutes.
Stuff I don't need.
All that good, healthy stuff. Good for you.
I know. When I sent that paper to you, did it come not formatted the way I sent it to you? Because see, this was my first time. I'm trying to think, what did I send to Mr. Dave? I think I did his in Word.
It came as a PDF, and there were a total of 6 1/4 pages, including the title page. And the title page I don't count as text.
See, on my end, it says 7 pages.
Yeah, it says 7 pages, but the margins were too wide or too big. I'm making you work for it.
I see. But that's why I was like, because usually it was my very first time ever using Google Docs.
Yeah.
And I'm so used to using Word, and my Word had expired on my computer.
Oh, okay.
And then once it expired, I just used the white Word. And then what I've always done is I would type it up, print it out, scan it in, and then email it.
Okay.
And so that's why I was trying to figure it out. So
I think you're
formatted.
You're going to be safe anyway, because you'll do well on the test. So you're going to be okay.
I'll take a beat.
Well, you'll make it in the class. I'm sure you will. But I had one student, and he just loved to write. I would say minimum 6 pages, double space. He would write 15 single space. So I thought, well, that may knock your grade down, but that's too much.
Those papers I sent about today, I think one of them about God speaks. I think that's one. It was either God speak or the one on the Satan.
Mm-hmm.
God speaks a ton. Your wife, friend, we got another one. Anyway, I think it was God speaking. I think that one right there, I went crazy on that one. Because you know, once you get, oh, I'm sorry. Once you get to typing and going, sometimes you can't, it's like it's hard to find the
Hard to
ending.
quit. I hear you. We're gonna get started, so everybody is ready to go here. Malachi, chapter 2.
Yeah.
Finishing up. May not even need the whole class time tonight, but that's fine. I think I've got everybody's papers, everybody's research papers have been turned in. I think I got everybody's tests back in time. So tomorrow morning or tonight, you will get the notes from Malachi and the test from Malachi. And I need that back from you by next Monday's class time, so you can get credit for that exam, and then you're done with the final grades. So, all right. Malachi chapter 2 is opening up by addressing again the priests. Of course, the priests have been the primary subjects of the addresses so far, because they are the leaders and they were expected to be righteous. And we'll bring that chair up, Rich. You're welcome to. You go right ahead. So in Malachi 2 and verse 1, now you priests, this commandment is for you. And the word commandment or command is applied to that which the Lord resolved to bring upon a person. That's what the word actually means. So this is something that's going to happen to them. But again, notice the conditions in verse 2. If you will not hear, and if you will not lay it to heart to give glory unto my name, saith the Lord of hosts, I will even send a curse upon you, and I will curse your blessings. Yea, I have cursed them already, because you do not lay it to heart. Again, we tried to point out here throughout these prophets, why doesn't God immediately destroy them when they're disobedient? Because he's merciful. He's got a bigger plan in mind. He needs to keep the lineage going, for one, so that the Messiah can come. But what about all these others? Well, it's because he's merciful. So again, this is what he's saying, this condition. We think sometimes about the conditional promises that God makes. God makes a promise, and its fulfillment is conditioned upon our response, our obedience to it. Well, here is kind of a different take on the condition. He says, if you will not hear, again, the condition, if you won't hear, and if you won't lay it to heart, then I will punish you. Okay. So again, oftentimes we say, if you will do this, if you will do that, then I will bless you. But so now he's saying, if you will not do this and will not do that, then I will punish you. And again, let's keep in mind, he doesn't want to. God takes no pleasure in the death of the wicked. Ezekiel 33 and verse 11 says, God is not willing that any should perish, 2 Peter 3 and verse 9. So God wanted them to obey him, but he didn't just want their thoughtless obedience, did he? He says, I have cursed your blessings already. Why? The end of verse 2. What does he say? Why was he punishing them? They didn't take it to heart. Okay? So God wanted their heart. God wanted them to glorify him. Now, the New American Standard, instead of saying, I will send a curse upon you, actually says the curse upon you, which I think is interesting. Keep your finger there, and let's go back to Deuteronomy 28.
There's also a curse.
Right, I think most of them say a curse. The New American Standard says the curse.
Okay.
But I wonder if this could be a reference back to something that Moses said, kind of in summary, preparing them for when they would be going into the land of Canaan. But look what he says. This is Deuteronomy 28, and start in verse 15 through verse 19. Let's see, are you there, Emily?
Yes. Who are standing here with us today in the presence of the Lord our God, but also with those who are not here today. You did say verse chapter 29, right?
28.
I'm sorry, that
15 through 19.
Yeah,
28, 15 through 19.
Okay, however, if you do not obey the Lord your God and do not carefully follow all his commands and decrees I am giving you today, all these curses will come upon you and overtake you. You will be cursed in the city and cursed in the country. Your basket and your kneading trough will be cursed. The fruit of your womb will be cursed, and the crops of your land, and the calves of your herds, and the lambs of your flocks. You will be cursed when you come in, and cursed when you go out.
Okay, and he just keeps on going with that from that verse on there. So again, he told them, right? God gave ample warning in advance of what would happen. Verse 3, behold, I will corrupt your seed and spread dung upon your faces, even the dung of your solemn feasts, and one shall take you away with it. Continuation of the thought in verse 2. The word seed could be the seed of the field, or he could be talking about their offspring, but I think he's still talking about the seed of their field that is not going to produce. He talks about the dung of their solemn feasts here, or the dung that will be spread upon your face. The dung of the solemn feasts was the refuse remaining from the killing of the animals. Exodus 29:14, the refuse from the animals, what was left over from the animals they sacrificed, they were supposed to take it outside of the city and burn it. And then he says, there you will be swept away, or you will be carried away, at the end of verse 3. Verse 4, you shall know that I have sent this commandment unto you, that my covenant might be with Levi, saith the Lord of hosts. So it's going to be evident that this was God's doing, and this was not something that was just coincidental. Now, some versions in verse 4, instead of saying, the King James says in verse 4 that my covenant might be with Levi, the New American Standard says that my covenant may continue with Levi. In the alternate reading, it says be with Levi. And let me talk about that just for a second, because that's really not an appropriate translation. This is a comment from Kyle and Delich. It says the word does indeed mean to exist. It does not mean to continue or to be maintained. And Kaufman says this. He says, what is seen here is the annulment of the Levitical covenant of the Jewish priesthood, a cancellation due to the persistent and total violation of it by Levi himself in the person of the priests, from whom all priests were derived. So again, if the version, and I think New American Standard falls short on this, that says my covenant will continue with Levi, the covenant with Levi is coming to an end by the time this is being written. It's going to come to an end. And it's going to be replaced with a better covenant, that is the covenant of Christ.
You said it's more accurate that it said my covenant will be with Levi?
Right, that my covenant might be with Levi. So in other words, and well, let me bring in verse 5 to go with that, because he says in verse 5, my covenant was with him of life and peace, and I gave to them for the fear wherewith he feared me and was afraid before my name. So I sent this commandment unto you that my covenant might be with Levi. He had made the covenant with Levi. It was with Levi, present tense. It was in existence at that time. So you might read it to say, my covenant exists with Levi. Or I made a covenant with Levi because he was planning to bless that tribe by allowing them to be the priesthood. But in verse 5, this would disagree with the translation that says that the covenant would continue, because he says the covenant was with him. That's what it was. It started out as a covenant of life and peace, but it changed. Now, why did it change? Did God change it? Well, the reason it changed was because of their disobedience. So it says, go ahead.
Are you saying that when we read like in the ESV that my covenant may be Levi, he's basically dismissing it back to Levi, and he's basically canceling out the covenant?
Yeah, and I think we're going to see that as we go on into the chapter some more. But
so it's a slick way of saying my covenant with Levi and we're leaving.
Right, and yeah, exactly. He originally set it up with him, but then the Levitical priesthood went away from him, and so he has broken that covenant. He is in the process of breaking that covenant, even to the point where he's now speaking of it in past tense. Okay. Or perhaps just referencing the fact when he's using the phrase in past tense in verse 5, that he's saying that's how it started out. The purpose of his covenant was to be a covenant of life and peace. That's how it started out. But they went away from him. Okay. So reading on, this is Kaufman again saying one should reread the last 3 chapters of Deuteronomy in which it is boldly and clearly declared that all of God's covenant blessings of Israel were contingent absolutely upon Israel's maintaining a faithful and obedient attitude. This passage shows that the same applied to the Levitical covenant, as indeed it does to all covenants, even including the covenant of salvation in Jesus Christ. Okay, verse 6, continuation of verse 5, that God required obedience from the priests in order for the covenant to continue. The law of truth was in his mouth, iniquity was not found in his lips. He walked with me in peace and equity and did turn away many from iniquity. Verse 7 shows what God expected of the priests and why he expected it. For the priest's lips should keep knowledge, and they should seek the law at his mouth. Why? Because he is the messenger of the Lord of hosts. Okay, so kind of bringing this all up before we go on to the next point in verse 8. Talking about my covenant is with, or might be with, Levi. And intended for the covenant to be with Levi. I made a covenant with Levi, God says. It was with him. It was a covenant of life and peace. I gave it to him, expecting him to fear me, to respect me, to reverence me. Initially, the law of truth was in his mouth. He followed me faithfully, walked with me in peace and equity, turned many away from iniquity. And that's what God expected of him. But now to verse 8. You are departed out of the way. You have caused many to stumble at the law. You have corrupted the covenant of Levi, saith the Lord of hosts. Okay. So again, harking back all the way to the time of the blessings that God gave to the tribe of Levi, and how the centuries have passed, and how the descendants of Levi had corrupted God's way. So what does verse 8 say? There are three things that are noted here, three sins of the priests. What's the first one? What were they doing that was displeasing to God? What's the first one in the list? You turned away.
Stumbled.
You go with that a little bit more. You stumbled with.
Stumbled at the law.
Okay, but who did that? There you go. Keep going.
You have caused many to stumble.
You have caused many to stumble. Okay, so there, because of the fact that they left the way, what kind of influence was that having on the other people?
To be corrupted.
Okay, exactly. All right. And so the third part is you had corrupted the covenant of Levi. So it wasn't just them as the spiritual leaders who were corrupt, they were causing other people to stumble as well. Remember what Jesus said about that in Luke 17, 1 and 2. You know, what's he say about causing a little one to stumble, causing someone else to fall away from God?
You can learn that millstone to turn a foot around your neck and throw into the sea.
Okay, exactly right. So this is a very serious statement that God is making about them. In verse 9, therefore have I also made you contemptible and base before all the people, according as you have not kept my ways, but have been partial in the law. All right, so still now, again, he's talking about how things started out with the Levites, how God intended it to be, and what they had turned it into, what they had turned the covenant they had with him into. He says in verse 9 that you are contemptible in the eyes of the people. Why? Well, the end of the verse says, first of all, it says you haven't kept my ways, so people don't respect you. People don't respect you because you say one thing and do something else. But then the last part of the verse, you have been partial in the law. And actually in the alternate reading here in the King James, it says you have accepted faces. And that's a very literal thing, but what's he talking about? You've been partial in the law. What do you think he's talking about? Okay, uphold what you want, depending on, maybe even depending on who you let influence you. Yeah, because we've seen that before, right? We saw that in Amos. We've seen that in the other prophets, that they were taking bribes. So again, now he's saying, in the eyes of the people, you priests have lost respect because you're not doing what I told you to do, and you're cheating people. You're not godly men. So people have lost respect for you. All right, verse 10. He talks about in verse 9 about their partiality. Verse 10 tells them why they should not be showing partiality. Have we not all one Father? Hath not one God created us? Why do we deal treacherously every man against his brother by profaning the covenant of our fathers? Remember, there were certain things that God instituted in the law of Moses to ensure that the Jews would take care of each other, the Israelites would take care of each other. One of them is that they weren't supposed to abuse one another through the use of usury or exorbitant interest rates. They weren't to take advantage of one another. That's just one example. But here he's saying, if we're to ask the question, well, Lord, why shouldn't we be partial toward other people? Why shouldn't we show favoritism? And his point in verse 10 is because you all have one Father, the same God has created you. These are your brothers who you hurting. So he's trying to bring them back to that. Verse 11. Now he is addressing not just the priests, but he's addressing the whole nation of Judah. Judah hath dealt treacherously, and an abomination is committed in Israel and in Jerusalem. For Judah hath profaned the holiness of the Lord which he loved, and hath married the daughter of a strange god. All right, this is from Albert Barnes. Again, he's addressing the whole nation of Judah. He said, unlawful marriages and unlawful lusts were in themselves a special profanation of holiness. The high priest was to take a virgin of his own people to wife and not profane his seed among the people. And that's according to Leviticus 21:14 and 15. The priests who married strange wives defiled the priesthood and the covenant of the priesthood. The marriage with idolaters brought as one consequence the profanation by their idolatries. Keep your finger here in Malachi. Let's go back to Nehemiah 13 and see what was happening there. This is Nehemiah chapter 13. And Rich, if you'll get over there, I'll ask you to read that, please. I'll read some verses in a minute. Nehemiah 13:23 through 29.
In those days also I saw the Jews that had married women of Ashdod, of Ammon, and of Moab. And their children spake half in the speech of Ashdod, and could not speak in the Jews' language, according to the language of each people. And I contended with them, and cursed them, and smote certain of them, and plucked off their hair, and made them swear by God, saying, Ye shall not give your daughters unto their sons, nor take their daughters for your sons, or for yourselves. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin by these things? Yet among many nations there was no king like him. And he was beloved of his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, even him did foreign women cause to sin. Shall we then hearken unto you to do all this great evil, to trespass against our God in marrying foreign women? One of the sons of Joiada, the son of Eliasib, the high priest, was son-in-law to Sanballat the Horonite. Therefore I chased him from me. Remember them, O my God, because they have defiled the priesthood and the covenant of the priesthood and of the Levites.
Okay, and Tony, can you get Deuteronomy 7, verses 2 and 3? Deuteronomy 7, 2 and 3. Okay, so we remember Nehemiah is speaking after they had come back from Babylonian captivity. Moses in Deuteronomy 7 is speaking before they even go into the promised land. So see what he says, Deuteronomy 7, verses 2 and 3.
Deuteronomy 7, 2 and 3, this is King James. It says, and when the Lord thy God shall deliver them before thee, thou shalt smite them and utterly destroy them. They shall make no covenant with them, nor shew mercy unto them. Neither shall thou make marriage with them. Thy daughter thou shalt not give unto his son, nor his daughter shalt thou take unto thy son.
Okay, so what was Moses concerned about before they were going to go into Canaan when he says, don't marry into the idolatrous families? What was he concerned about?
Yeah, don't marry to sin.
Okay, all right. When we just read from Nehemiah, what was happening as these Jewish men were marrying the women of Ashdod and Ammon and so on? The second verse that you read, what was happening? He says they were speaking in the language of Ashdod. Okay, so they were picking up the ways of idolatry even as children. Okay, what happened to Solomon, who had 700 wives and 300 concubines? What did they do?
He built temples to their gods.
Okay, he went away from God. Okay, so all the way back to there, and we could go over others. I think of, the intermarrying between some of the kings of the northern kingdom of Israel with, just take Jezebel, for instance. That's not somebody we hold up as a great example of a wife. Okay, so now come all the way back to Malachi. And guess what? Centuries later, they're doing it again. So it just something that they continue to engage in. Verse 12, specifically talking about this abomination that's been committed in Israel. Judah has profaned the holiness of the Lord. Why? Because he has married the daughter of a strange or a foreign god. Okay. Verse 12. The Lord will cut off the man that doeth this, the master and the scholar, out of the tabernacles of Jacob, and him that offereth an offering unto the Lord of hosts. Based on the King James reading, the New American Standard says, as for the man who does this, may the Lord cut off from the tents of Jacob every one who awakes and answers, or presents an offering to the Lord of hosts. The King James says that will cut off the master and the scholar, which would indicate no man would go unpunished. The master and the scholar would be like the elite. Okay. That even they're not going to escape the punishment of God for doing this.
What verse does it mention there?
Verse 12 says, again, the New American Standard says, everyone who awakes and answers.
Okay, this one says whoever he may be.
Okay. And the King James says, the Lord will cut off the man that doeth this, the master and the scholar. In the alternate reading in the column, it says, him that waketh and him that answereth. Okay. I think bottom line, he's saying nobody is above the punishment. In fact, Smith says this, J.M. Smith says, him that walketh and him that answereth has been rendered as teacher and scholar, son and grandson, master and servant, stranger and kinsman. So those two words get a lot of different translations apparently, but the bottom line is nobody's going to escape the punishment of God for engaging in these sins. Barnes says this, him that offereth an offering unto the Lord of hosts. That's the end of verse 12. He says, in other words, the one who doing these things offers an offering to God to bribe him, as it were, to connivance at his sin. In the same meaning, Isaiah says that God hates iniquity in the solemn meeting. God said, I hate robbery with burnt offering. Or in Proverbs 15:8, he says, the sacrifice of the wicked is an abomination to the Lord. Proverbs 28:9, he that turneth away his ear from hearing the law, his prayer shall be an abomination. Amos said, I despise your feast days and will not accept your solemn assemblies. So isn't God saying, like he said before in verse 12, if you're going to continue in these things, in fact, remember we saw back in chapter 1, in verse 11, or verse 10 rather, that in essence God may be saying in chapter 1 and verse 10, just go ahead and close the temple doors, because if you're going to be like that, I don't want anything from you. And he seems to be saying the same thing here. If you're going to keep on in these abominable acts, don't even bring your offerings to me anymore. I won't take them. Okay.
I think another interesting point that's brought out in that passage in Malachi is just the corollary between faithfulness to God and the faithfulness that a husband is expected to have to his wife in God's eyes. And says there, in, I guess it's verse 14, the latter part of 14, that the Lord is acting as a witness between you and the wife of your youth, because you have broken faith with her, though she is your partner, the wife of your marriage covenant. There's some stories, there's quite a few in the Old Testament that show that God did allow certain things to happen because of the hardness of their heart in the Old Testament. This plainly points out that God's desire is that a marriage stay together and be for life and not be something that's just broken.
True. And there's something else we're going to see in just a minute when we get there, but that's exactly right. That God still had that standard that he set in Genesis chapter 2 about the one man, one woman for life. So there's something else I want to bring out about that as well. In verse 13, he says, this have you done again. So again, you've done it again. You're still doing the same thing. covering the altar of the Lord with tears, with weeping, and with crying out, insomuch that he regardeth not the offering any more, or receiveth it with goodwill at your hand. There are two thoughts regarding the reference here to tears, weeping, and crying. Some say that the people he's addressing were going through the motions, that they were crying for show but not turning to God from the heart. Okay, well, that's a possibility because we've already seen that they did not have their heart in their service to God, right? Okay. We also see in the previous two verses that he's saying to them, if you're going to live abominably and offer these offerings to me, I really don't want your offerings. So it could be that they're carrying on like they're righteous when actually they're just abominable in the way that they're doing. And then some say that the tears, weeping, and crying actually has reference to the tears of these wives who are being oppressed. We're going to talk about them now in verse 14. So here's this oft repeated phrase in Malachi where God has just said, you have committed abomination by taking wives of foreign gods. You're offering to me in a hypocritical way. Whatever the tears and the weeping is of verse 13, the fake worship or the tears that you're causing to come from the hearts of those ladies you're abusing. In verse 14, the people come back and say, what do you mean? When did we ever do that? What have we done wrong? And so the New American Standard says at the end of verse 13, he says, God no longer regards the offering or accepts it with favor from your hand. Yet you say, for what reason? So again, as they've done in these other passages, and we're going to see again in just a few more verses, they're saying, what did we do wrong? We don't think we did anything wrong, Lord. Okay. Now, why can't they see it? Because they've left the Word of God, and they don't care what God says anymore. It's all a matter of what they want. Okay, sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? So, wherefore, again, the term expresses the same arrogant attitude in claim of innocence that we saw back in chapter 1, verse 6 and verse 7. Now, this statement here in the rest of verse 14, because the Lord hath been a witness between thee and the wife of thy youth, against whom thou hast dealt treacherously, yet is she thy companion and the wife of thy covenant. Just to expand on what you were saying, Emily. Look and see if you don't see a distinction here between the wife of your youth in verse 14 and then back to verse 11, you have married the daughter of a strange god. It would look like, and it seems to me what he's indicating here, that they were divorcing the wives of their youth and going and marrying these idolatrous women.
Absolutely. I agree, because one verse I didn't really point out, but it's right there in 16, I hate divorce,
Right.
Says the Lord God of Israel. And Jesus quotes that in the Sermon on the Mount, I believe. God hates divorce. So it's definitely part of it.
Okay. I believe that's true. That it looks like they were being abused and God expected them to stay with their wives. So the term treacherously in the King James in verse 14, against whom thou hast dealt treacherously, is also translated deceitfully. God expected better treatment of their wives than what they were doing. Verse 15, he goes on with that thought. Did not he make one? It had he the residue of the Spirit, and wherefore one, that he might seek a goodly seed. Therefore take heed to your spirit, and let none deal treacherously, there's that word again, against the wife of his youth. Verse 15 in the New American Standard. But that one has done so who has a remnant of the Spirit. But not one has done so who has a remnant of the Spirit. And what did that one do while he was seeking a godly offspring? Take heed then to your spirit, and let no one deal treacherously against the wife of your youth. So God had made the husband and wife one in marriage, Genesis 2:24. The Hebrew text may be translated more satisfactorily. Not anyone has done so who has a remnant of the Spirit. In other words, no one acts as you have done who has in him any of that divine life which God at first breathed into man. Or to say it another way, no man of conscience and virtue has ever treated his wife like that. Okay.
I've got a question. So,
Okay.
Up in 13, he's talking about covering the altar with tears and weeping and sighing. And we're talking about the fact that they may have actually joined in marriage with these idolatrous women. Would the tears and weeping be that they're bringing the wives of their youth to present a sacrifice like their family unit, but they're not? Is that what's happening there? Because the sacrifices were a family thing.
Yeah, it's possible. Putting on a show, in other words, bring the whole family, but we're not really here. Yeah, it's possible. There is definitely hypocrisy in these verses, in not only in their service and their offering to God, but also in the way that they're treating their family and their wives.
I'm slightly misquoted there. Jesus doesn't quote that exactly in the Sermon on the Mount, but he definitely addresses the concept in chapter 5,
Okay.
Matthew 31 through 32. Anyway, but back to this that y'all were just speaking of. Maybe it's just the way my version reads, but it sounds like to me that it's the fact that they're making a request and pleas to God about things and he's not paying attention to them, that they're crying, and he's not listening to the crying either. But again, maybe it's just the way this reads, but what mine says is, another thing you do, you flood the Lord's altar with tears, you weep and wail because he no longer pays attention to your offerings or accepts them with pleasure from your hands.
Okay.
But
That's
to me, it
verse
sounds
13.
like
It's a little
the
bit.
men maybe who have done these things, but it may just be interpretation or
Okay.
translation of it.
Well, and again, from that perspective, why? And I don't really see that, but let's run with that for a second. From that perspective, they're going to the altar and they're crying out because God isn't receiving anything from them anymore. So why isn't God receiving anything from them?
Yeah, he's not accepting their
Right, he's not
offering.
accepting. Why is he not? You tell me, why is he not accepting their offering?
Just like you said earlier, they're not in the word.
All right, because they're hypocrisy, because their heart's not in it, and because they're living one way and doing this. Okay, and when they're offering, back in chapter 1, what kind of things are they offering?
The least.
Yeah.
The worst. Okay.
Defective.
All right. So if we run with that idea that they're saying, Lord, why won't you accept this? And maybe that's the first part of verse 14 would fit in that, where they say, why won't God accept our offering anymore? And God explains it to them. And, why won't you accept? We don't understand. Well, the reason I won't accept it is because you're not following me. Okay. So there's some validity to that, I think, to what you're saying. All right, back in verse 15, where he says, and wherefore one, this is King James, that he might seek a godly seed. The pulpit commentary says this, he says, why did one act in this way? Was it that he might have godly children? Surely not. No one would divorce his lawful Hebrew wife, marry an idolatress who wished to leave a holy posterity behind him. And then Gill says this about the phrase, and wherefore one. What is the reason why he made but one woman when he could have made 10,000 or as many as he pleased? The answer is that he might seek a godly seed or a seed of God, a noble, excellent seed, a legitimate offering born in true and lawful wedlock. Okay. So what he's saying here, again, back to the fact that God expected the one man and one woman. Why did he allow the multiple marriages? Well, we know that Acts 17:30 talks about the times of ignorance that God overlooked, and that's a whole other subject. But we do also remember that he certainly never approved of the marriages that were outside of Judaism, of the Israelite race. You wanted?
Isn't there something about the hardness of their heart that was brought into at least one of those references?
Well, in Matthew 19, when they asked Jesus, the Pharisees asked Jesus, why did Moses give a bill of divorce? Why did Moses allow divorce to be had? And Jesus said, because of the hardness of your hearts. Right? He allowed it because without it, then these poor ladies who were being abused would have to continue to take that abuse. All right, so again, the warning at the end of verse 15 to same thing he said earlier, don't deal deceitfully against the wife of your youth. Verse 16 now. For the Lord, the God of Israel, saith that he hateth putting away. For one covereth violence with his garment, saith the Lord of hosts. Therefore take heed to your spirit, that you deal not treacherously. The alternate reading for that in the King James says, the Lord, the God of Israel, saith if he hate her, put her away. Okay, that is very difficult to support that particular translation. The New American Standard says, I hate divorce. Pretty straight and simple. That's what he's saying here. He hates divorce. So he is not saying, well, if you don't like her anymore, you can put her away. However, what's interesting about somebody saying this is an alternate reading for that is that it's not out of reason to think that there were some in that day who were advocating that. When we come to the first century, when Jesus was dealing with the divorce in Matthew chapter 19, there were two primary schools of thought in Jerusalem. One was by a rabbi named Shammai, the other was by a rabbi named Hillel, Hillel. And I can't remember which one it was, but one of those two taught that if a man found any displeasure in his wife, that he could divorce her and marry somebody else. And that concept of displeasure became so broad, that definition in his mind or in his school became so broad that basically, if you didn't like the way the wife cooked breakfast anymore, you could divorce her. If you didn't like the way she dressed, if maybe she didn't appeal to you like she used to, you could put her away. Basically, if you found anything in your wife that you didn't like anymore, you could divorce her and marry somebody else. Was it Hillel? Okay. And so now you see why Jesus is bringing them back. You see Jesus is bringing them back to saying, no, there's only one reason that you're allowed to divorce and remarry, and that is the adultery on the part of the spouse. Okay. And the adultery of the spouse, and the innocent party may remarry, the guilty one may not. Okay, I'm sorry, Tim.
Could you, in a sense, say with that particular text and that particular scripture there, or that word of saying putting them away, put her away, could you also tie that together with Mary and Joseph in a sense? I mean, he didn't hate her.
Right.
He just hated the situation.
Yeah. Well, technically they weren't even married at that point.
Yeah.
So they were just betrothed to each other. So
he had the impression that she had been unfaithful
Right.
to the covenant.
Right. And that had more to do with putting away because of her sin. Where in this particular case, where he's talking about the putting away, the divorcing, in this particular context, is men who are doing it because they just don't like their wife anymore and they want to get somebody else.
But were you asking, did he mean divorce basically by putting away?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't believe so. I believe that would be a different matter.
Like you said, they wasn't married.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. If you go back into the law of Moses, go back into the first, like Deuteronomy, where you have instructions on how a man was to treat his fiancée if he found that she had been impure. Okay, so he was just following that.
And just to circle around Hillel and Shammai believed the divorce was only allowed in fairly serious transgression.
Okay. Where Hillel was like, if you just don't like anything about her anymore. Okay. Yeah, pretty much. Okay. Which he exists today, doesn't he? Okay. So again, God hates divorce. In King James, it says, "For one covered violence with his garment." Colin Dellich said, "We may either render these words, he who puts away his wife covers his garment with sin, or sin covers his garment. The meaning is the same in either case, namely that wickedness will adhere irremovably to such a man. The figurative expression may be explained from the idea that the dress reflects the inward part of a man. Therefore, a soiled garment is a symbol of uncleanness of heart." So again, at the end of the verse, he says, one more time, "Take heed to your spirit that you deal not treacherously." Verse 17 then, God was tired of their words. "You have wearied the Lord with your words," and here they are again. What do you mean? Wherein have we wearied you? When you say, "Everyone that doeth evil is good in the sight of the Lord, and he delighteth in them." Well, where's the God of judgment? Okay. That's reminiscent of Isaiah talking about those in his day who were calling evil good and good evil. But here, maybe another sense to this as well. When they say, what do you mean we've made God tired of our words? Well, he says, you say that everybody who does evil is good in the sight of the Lord. In other words, you either you are changing the standards or you think God doesn't care. So you're telling the people, do whatever you want to because God doesn't care. Ooh, watch this one. Go ahead and do what you want to, no matter what, because in the end, God's going to save anybody anyway. Does that sound familiar?
You know, BuzzFeed is real big on portraying God's love like that.
Okay.
They just take you like you are because He loves you just as you.
Right.
He wants you to be happy.
He wants you to be happy. So God said, I'm tired of you. I'm tired of your words. Why? Because you keep saying things that are evil are okay in the sight of God. I think that's the key. Everyone who does evil everyone who does evil is good in the sight of the Lord. That it doesn't matter. They're saying it doesn't matter. God has no standard. And in fact, even in the King James goes on to say, it says he delights in them. And the New American Standard says the same thing. It says he delights in them. So not only are they saying those who are evil, that God doesn't care, but God's happy with them. And then they ask this question, where is the God of judgment? That they didn't really want to ask that question because they're going to get an answer. But perhaps another way to look at that question, where is the God of judgment, based on what we just read in the previous part of the sentence, where they're going about saying it doesn't matter to God. In fact, he just is happy for you to be happy. Just whatever you want to do. And then they're saying, where is God? If God, the God of judgment was here, he would have done something about this. If he didn't like what we were doing, he would have struck us down. And again, that's happened before. Psalm 73, that happened back then. 2 Peter chapter 3, where is his coming? These Christians are saying the Lord is coming, Jesus is coming. Where is he? Everything's the same since the beginning of time, they said. And then Peter explained it by saying, don't misunderstand. God is patient. God is long-suffering, not willing that any should perish. Okay. Anything else on chapter 2?
That latter part of verse 16 where y'all were discussing the garment and the violence. The way mine reads, it almost sounds like it's saying, I hate someone who is so entrenched in violence that it's almost like a garment, kind of like we're supposed to be clothed in righteousness.
Right.
Because mine reads, I hate a man's covering himself with violence as well as with his garment, which to me kind of means it's like an analogy of he's almost clothed in violence, but I don't know.
Well, the New American Standard says, I hate divorce, says the Lord, the God of Israel, and him who covers his garment with wrong. So in either of those cases, even from the King James, I think the same thing is being said in all these cases, that, you stained yourself.
Yeah, I don't think it's so much about a physical garment.
No.
Oh, okay. I thought y'all were.
No, was not saying that at all.
Okay.
The reference from Colin Delich was, he said this, the figurative expression may be explained from the idea that the dress reflects the inward part of the man. Therefore, a soiled garment is a symbol of uncleanness. So what he's saying is that not literally, because he used the term figurative, not literally is he talking about them wearing stained garments. Okay. All right, chapter 3. Introducing chapter 3 with these statements from Kaufman. He says, this and the following chapter are among the most messianic passages in the Old Testament. This is appropriate indeed because of the long, long night of Israel's new status, not any longer that of the faithful covenant people, yet still preserved and protected through the providence of God until the promised Messiah should arrive. That long, long night of about half a millennium was at this point in Israel's history about to begin. Indeed, it had already begun. Israel is no longer referred to by God's prophet as the people of God, but as this whole nation. They would abide many days for God without king, without prince, without altar, without sacrifice, and without ephod and teraphim. Hosea 3, 4, and 5. So these last last two chapters are the last inspired, divinely inspired words before the angel appeared to Zechariah, before the events of surrounding the birth of the conception of and birth of John, the conception of the birth of Jesus. 400-year period that we call the intertestamental period. So the Old Testament ends with words of hope and promise, something to look forward to. And as we mentioned before, we know that through the intertestamental period that there were those who rose up to defend and to fight for the nation of Judah. And many thought them to be the deliverers, the Messiah, but they weren't. There were many who stood up and claimed to be the Christ, but they weren't. There were some specific things that they should be looking for. And of course, these folks weren't going to be alive during that time, but God expected these teachings to be carried down through the generations. So, beginning in verse 1, they just asked the question, where is the God of judgment, or the God of justice? Verse 1 of chapter 3, behold, I will send my messenger. He shall prepare the way before me. And the Lord, look at that, whom ye seek. You're just asking, where is he? And the Lord whom you seek shall suddenly come to his temple, even the messenger of the covenant whom ye delight in. Behold, he shall come, saith the Lord of hosts. All right, so the messenger is who? I will send my messenger who will prepare the way. It's John, okay? It's John the Baptist, John the Immerser, okay? And then he's talking about the next one, the Lord whom you seek, the one who you're asking where he is. He's going to come. He's going to come into his temple. Bickerstaff says this. He says, practically all commentators in regard to the phrase, he shall prepare the way before me. Practically all commentators on this passage have recognized that Malachi's prophecy is supplementary to the promise of Isaiah 40, verses 3 through 5. Keep your finger here, and let's go to Isaiah 40, verses 3 through 5. Isaiah 40, verses 3 through 5. Emily, we'll come back to you if you don't mind reading that, please.
The voice of one calling in the desert, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight in the wilderness a highway for our God. Every valley shall be raised up, every mountain and hill made low. The rough ground shall become level, and the rugged places a plain. And the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all mankind together will see it, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken.
Okay, so again, comparable to what Malachi is saying here, Bickerstaff in his commentary goes on to say the metaphor of Isaiah's prophecy means that in a manner comparable to that of ancient monarchs who sent messengers ahead of them to make preparation, to smooth the roads, etc. Just so in like manner before the Lord will come in the person of Christ, a preparer will go before him, herald is coming, and make ready the people to receive him. So John is preparing the way, the Lord would come suddenly to his temple, and we know that he did actually go into the literal temple. And he uses the term delight, even the messenger of the covenant whom you delight in, or desire is another term that could be used as a translation. Verse 2. But who may abide the day of his coming? Who shall stand when he appeareth? For he is like a refiner's fire and like fuller's soap. So even though this one would be coming, his predecessor would come, not predecessor, but his preparer would come before him, and then he would come. But nonetheless, they would not tolerate him. Malachi seems to blend as Joel, the first and second coming of Christ. The first coming, too, was a time of sifting and severance, according as those to whom he came did or did not receive him. So Jesus had said in, I got to give the right reference now. I don't want to give the wrong reference. I want to say Luke chapter 14. No, excuse me. Luke chapter 12 and verse 51. Suppose ye that I am come to give peace on earth, I tell you nay, but rather division. Then verses 52 and 53. For from henceforth there shall be 5 in one house divided, 3 against 2 and 2 against 3. The father shall be divided against the son, and the son against the father. The mother against the daughter, and the daughter against the mother. The mother-in-law against her daughter-in-law, and the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And again, that seems a little inconsistent if we don't look carefully at what's being said, because we know Jesus is called the Prince of Peace, and yet he said, I did not come to bring peace, but division. Well, in what sense? In the sense that he's coming to teach and to live the truth, and some are going to accept it and some aren't. And there's going to be division.
Right?
A sifting, just like he says here back in verse 2. He'll be like in a refiner's fire, like the fuller's soap is purified. Okay? Jesus was a controversial individual, was he not? Okay. Not in a bad way, of course, in a good way, but he was controversial in that they argued over who he was. And some saw him and recognized him for who he was and believed him to be the Christ, while others, not only, there were some who disbelieved, but there were some who violently disbelieved. And there was division among them. Okay. Verse 3. He shall sit as a refiner and purifier of silver, and he shall purify the sons of Levi, and purge them as gold and silver, that they may offer unto the Lord an offering in righteousness. Here's Kaufman's comments. He says, the messianic thrust of the passage continues here. The covenant with Levi is no more. We already saw that in chapter 2 and verse 5. There will be a new priesthood, namely the totality of all Christians in Christ. 1 Peter 2 and verse 9 talks about Christians being the priests now. Their offerings in righteousness shall be such as were spoken of by Peter, whose language shows that he had this very passage in mind. 1 Peter 1 verse 7, 1 Peter 2 and verse 5. He talks about the proof of your faith being more precious than gold, proved by fire. You're built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices to God by Jesus Christ. The sacrifices in righteousness offered by the Christian include our faith, the love of God, our words, our confession of Christ, our baptism into Christ, our praise, our contributions, our songs, our prayers, the entire life of a Christian. And you'll all get these in your notes. I don't expect you to write those down. But he concludes this by saying, in this dispensation, in the new covenant, the new covenant of Christ, the bloody sacrifices of the Mosaic law are replaced by spiritual sacrifices. These must be distinguished from the one great sacrifice of the blood of Christ for all men, which is the atonement for sin. Okay. So while he has a reference here to the sons of Levi, we already know that he's already dispensed with talk about the physical tribe of Levi having been in the past tense. Now, the sons of Levi, he's pointing toward something that is going to be in the new covenant, because we are priests. Again, 1 Peter 2, verse 5 and verse 9. Verse 4, then shall the offering of Judah and Jerusalem be pleasant unto the Lord, as in the days of old, as in former years. Perhaps it's reflecting back on the time of faithfulness in their history. Could even be reflecting back to the perfection in the Garden of Eden. This comment from Kyle, he said, we must not infer from Malachi 3 and 4 that Malachi imagined that Old Testament worship would be continued during Messianic times. His words are to be explained from the custom of the prophets, using forms of the Old Testament worship to depict the reverence for God, which would characterize the new covenant. Verse 5, they had been asking where the God of judgment was. The Lord said he's coming. When he would come, he would judge those who engaged in his evil deeds. So, verse 5, again, this all starts in chapter 2 and verse 17. Where is God? Well, I'm going to tell you where God is. First of all, he's going to send his messenger, and then he's going to come, and in essence, he's going to come in the person of Jesus, of the Christ. He's going to be rejected by some, but he's going to walk with those who follow him faithfully. Verse 5, I will come near to you in judgment. I will be a swift witness against the sorcerers, against the adulterers, against false swearers, against those that oppress the hireling and his wages, the widow and the fatherless, and that turn aside the stranger from his right, and fear me not, or fear not me, saith the Lord of hosts. Because, why? I am the Lord, I change not. Therefore, ye sons of Jacob are not consumed. Okay, yes.
Can't help but point out, since we just recently discussed this, but another indicator that God definitely is not one who overlooks adultery as no big deal. It's not something that we can just say, oh, well, times have changed and it's okay now. It's no big deal. Just because you're divorced, because you decided to commit adultery, doesn't make you really in a right relationship with that spouse, your ex-spouse, with God, with any of it.
Correct.
It's not good.
I agree. It's in that list of things here that he's going to judge. So again, they'd ask the question, where is he? He's coming, and he's still here. And he's going to manifest himself. Again, he's going to do that in the flesh in Jesus. And he's going to bring to judgment these evil deeds. And the fact that he says in verse 6, I am the Lord, I change not. I think that may tie in with what you just said. God has not lowered his standards. Now, his covenant has changed. We're not under the law of Moses anymore. We've been talking about that, just reference that. In fact, we don't have the animal sacrifices. We don't go to the temple. We don't do all these things. The covenant has changed, but the standards of God have not changed. I am the Lord, I do not change. I am holy. I will always be holy. And guess what I expect out of you? Be ye holy, Peter said in 1 Peter 1:15-16. God said, be ye holy, for I am holy. God expects the same thing. No matter what generation we're looking at, no matter what covenant, God expected to be obeyed.
Well, in that same verse, when I read it, where he says, therefore ye, O sons of Jacob, are not consumed, he hasn't changed in that he still loves them.
Exactly.
He hasn't changed to where he's going to just completely block them out. He is going to let them continue on. He's going to let them remnant grow.
And isn't that still an answer to what they asked in 2:17? Where's the God of judgment?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm coming, and I have the same standards as I always have because I haven't changed. But the reason the final judgment hasn't come upon you yet is because of the fact that of the things that do not change about me. One of those is that I'm a merciful and gracious God. If y'all don't mind, we'll just keep on going. We'll be probably done in about 15 minutes. Okay.
Just a real quick observation. It caught my ear when you were reading in verse 3 that would be like a refiner's fire or fuller's soap.
Mm-hmm.
I've never really heard that term. Mine says launderers. But when I looked up fuller in the olden times, they had certain elements they used to whiten clothes, but the fuller was known traditionally to stomp the clothes to clean them. I don't know if there's any real relevance there, but I thought it was very interesting.
Okay.
There you go.
There you go. I like it. Well, in either case, he's talking about purifying or cleaning something. Yeah. Okay. All right. So verse 7. Basically, the history of Israel and really mankind in general in turning from God. Even from the days of your fathers, you are gone away from my ordinances, have not kept them. God is begging, return unto me, and I'll return unto you, saith the Lord of hosts. But now, again, here's the answer. The King James says, wherein shall we return? Maybe a better way to say it would be to say, why do we need to return? We haven't done anything wrong. The New American Standard says, you say, how shall we return? So, the idea here is God said, throughout history, mankind has gone away from me. I'm urging you to return to me. And again, this just, as I read this, it just strikes me. As we said last week, when we see these questions from these people, it just strikes me that God would say to you, you need to return. And you would say in response to him, what do you mean I need to return? I don't know that I've done anything wrong that needs me to turn from the way I'm currently doing. Because again, that's pretty much what this whole tenor in their attitudes is about, isn't it? That we've seen as we've studied. They're kind of like, what did we do wrong? And they keep asking, what did we do? And God has to keep saying, well, look at verse 8. Will a man rob God? You have robbed me, but you say, wherein have we robbed you? What have we done wrong? They could not see how they had robbed God. And he says in tithes and offerings, well, remember back in chapter 1 and verse 8, what kind of things were they offering? They were offering the worst that they had. Okay. Verse 9, you are cursed with a curse, for you have robbed me, even this whole nation. Look at that. That is a significant phrase at the end of verse 9. It does not say, you have robbed me, my people. You have robbed me, this whole nation. James Adamson said this. He said, Israel is not here designated as my people or the people of God. The status of Israel from this time forward in human history was simply that of any other people on earth. The word translated nation here is normally used only of the heathen, and so it reminds them that their conduct was unworthy of a covenant people. Okay, very subtle, but very pointed. Verse 10 through verse 12. Basically, these verses, if they would just do what God said, they would be blessed. Bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in my house, and prove me now herewith, saith the Lord of hosts. If I will not open you the windows of heaven, and pour you out a blessing, that there shall not be room enough to receive it, I will rebuke the devourer for your sakes, and he shall not destroy the fruits of your ground, neither shall your vines cast her fruit before the time in the field, saith the Lord of hosts. And all nations shall call you blessed, for you shall be a delightsome land, saith the Lord of hosts. But it's conditional, isn't it? It's conditional. It's based on their obedience. Verse 13. Your words have been stout or strong against me, saith the Lord of hosts. Yet ye say, there they are again. What have we spoken so much against thee? The New American Standard. What have we spoken against you? When did we say anything bad about you or to you? Verse 14. You have said it is vain to serve God. And what profit is it that we have kept his ordinance and that we have walked mournfully before the Lord of hosts? New American Standard. You have said it is vain to serve God. What profit is it that we have kept his charge and that we have walked in mourning before the Lord of hosts? So what are they saying? God says, your words against me have been strong. And they said, when did we say anything against you? What does verse 14 tell us that they were saying? It's a waste of time to serve you. It's futile.
It makes you think back, a few verses ago where it said, where is the God of judgment? As we get here, it seems like the sentiment is, where is God? Why are we even worrying about this? He's not around here.
Right. So they've gone from saying, they've gone from we're offering to God, but we're going to give him what we want, to saying, he's not really care. I mean, he's here, but he doesn't really care. So anything that we think is evil, it's not evil. It's okay. Go ahead and do it anyway. And now they're at the point where they're saying, why should we bother serving anyway? It's just a waste of time. There's no profit. There's no value. He talks about we have walked mournfully before the Lord of hosts. In other words, that we have been convicted of our sins and mourned over our sins. Why did we waste our time doing that? We should go ahead and just live it up and get whatever else we can for the rest of our lives. That's what they're saying in verse 14. But now look at this in verse 15. Now we call the proud happy. Yea, they that work wickedness are set up. Yea, they that tempt God are even delivered. Again, I've got a cross-reference to Psalm 73 where the same thing is going on, where Asaph was questioning God, or remembering a time in his life when he questioned God. And he was looking at the wicked surrounding him who seemed to be doing so great. And here he was trying to serve God faithfully, and he was not having all the things that they were having. And he was even being persecuted, perhaps. And so now these people are saying, God has just talked about the punishment that he's put on them for the disobedience, the crops, the land, the housing, all those things that have not been prosperous. And he says the reason they're not prosperous is because of disobedience to me. And they don't get it still. And they're thinking that the reason they're suffering is because they're following God, instead of thinking the reason we're suffering is because we're not following God. They think it's because we're following God. And therefore, if we stop following God, good things are going to happen to us again. That doesn't make sense, but that's what they're thinking.
And they are mimicking or imitating the accuser. Mm-hmm. They are we like in Job, we talked about this at times. Mm-hmm. The New Testament called him Satan, with a different personality, but they are actually mimicking Satan in their ways, but they don't realize they're mimicking Satan in their ways.
And it's that influence of the idols. of the idolaters. Did you have something? Okay. All right, verse 16. Then they that feared the Lord spake often one to another, and the Lord hearkened and heard it. And a book of remembrance was written before him for them that feared the Lord and that thought upon his name. So there were still some who were being faithful. Remember, the ones who came back from Babylonian captivity, the remnant, they were faithful. But some of them went away. But there were still some faithful in that time, in Malachi's time. And it said those who were being faithful enjoyed fellowship with one another, to encourage one another, to hold up, even though their brethren were going against God. Verse 17, the promise regarding the faithful, they shall be mine, saith the Lord of hosts, in the day when I make up my jewels. And an alternate reading of the word jewels is a special treasure. Maybe your version says special treasure. The New American Standard says my own possession.
Just treasured possession.
Treasured possession, okay. And that day when I will make up my treasured possession, I will spare them as a man spareth his own son that serveth him. Then shall you return and discern between the righteous and the wicked, between him that serveth God and him that serveth him not. Okay, so there is God still holding out hope and promise, but it's contingent upon their obedience. Anything else on chapter 3?
Question.
Yes, sir.
When you go back to chapter 3, verse 1, behold, I will send my messenger. Here they are in reference to talking about John.
Mm-hmm.
Would you also say, in the same mindset of that, which is in the Old Testament, when Moses was a messenger, and then he passed it on to Joshua, and then in the New Testament we have John, but then later on we have Peter. Would you also say that preachers today, pastors, preachers, ministers, evangelists, could still come from this particular text of saying messengers?
Well, of course, we're supposed to be messengers of God's word. We're not supposed to preach the word, teach the truth, Ephesians 4:15, and love. We're supposed to carry the gospel, Matthew 28:18 through 20. So in that sense, we are messengers. In this context specifically, John is identified. And again, I referenced the one historian who noted that when a king would go on a trip, that he would send individuals before him announcing the king is coming, and they would clear the road for him. And so that's the idea here in this context of what John specifically had, a specific task that nobody else could fill. So in a broader sense, yeah, we're all messengers if we're preaching the word, teaching the word faithfully. But John specifically referenced it. But that's a good question. All right, chapter 4, verse 1, eternal damnation for the disobedient. For behold, the day cometh that shall burn as an oven, and all the proud, yea, and all that do wickedly shall be stubble. The day that cometh shall burn them up, saith the Lord of hosts, that it shall leave neither root nor branch. I love verse 2. But there is a day of judgment and destruction coming, but unto you that fear my name shall the Son of Righteousness arise with healing in his wings. You shall go forth and grow up as calves of the stall. All right, let me read this comment from Kaufman. He says, the witness of the whole Bible identifies God in Christ with the sun or the rising sun. God shall be as the light of the morning when the sun riseth. 2 Samuel 23:4. Jehovah God is a sun and shield. Psalm 84:11. The day spring, the sun rising from on high, shall visit us. Luke 1:78. There was the true light, Christ, even the light that lighteth every man coming into the world. John 1 and verse 9. Jesus said, I am the light of the world, John 8:12. Awake thou that sleepest, and arise from the dead, and Christ shall shine upon thee, Ephesians 5:14. You do well as that you take heed as unto a lamp shining in a dark place until the day dawn, and the day star arise in your hearts, 2 Peter 1 and verse 19. Who is the Son of Righteousness? It is Christ. And he rises with healing in his wings. What is that healing? Reconciliation by virtue of his blood and obedience to his gospel. Okay. Again, this is predicated upon fearing his name, which means obeying him and following him. You shall go forth, grow up as calves of the stall. The term there, this is Kaufman says, This is an agricultural metaphor from the care and feeding of livestock. Such carefully protected and cared for animals exhibit a quality of playful happiness that appears most desirable. Okay. So in other words, the idea here is those who fear God and follow him shall enjoy the healing, that would be the spiritual healing, of course, from Christ, and that we shall have joy and happiness. Verse 3, you shall tread down the wicked, for they shall be ashes under the soles of your feet. In the day that thou shalt do this, saith the Lord of hosts. Again, not that we're literally going to be in a battle and start stomping on people. But the point is that we will have the victory. There will be nothing that can defeat us if we walk faithfully with God. Verse 4, remember ye the law of Moses, my servant, which I commanded unto him in Horeb for all Israel with the statutes and judgments. This is a final exhortation to the original hearers to follow the law of Moses, which they were still under. And then verses 5 and 6. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. He shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse. Who is Elijah in this passage? It is John. Matthew 17, verses 10 through 13. I'll make a cross-reference there. Matthew 17, verses 10 through 13. His disciples asked him, saying, why then say the scribes that Elijah must come first? Jesus answered and said unto them, Elijah truly shall first come and restore all things. But I say unto you that Elijah is come already, and they did not know him, but they have done unto him whatsoever they wanted. Likewise shall also the Son of Man treat him, shall also the Son of Man suffer of them rather. Then verse 13, then the disciples understood he spake unto them of John the Baptist, John the Immerser. Okay. Final words from Kaufman here. He says, all of God's prophets had done their work, but the people had rejected them all. There was no further word that God could send. The hardened and rebellious nation would continue to exist according to God's holy purpose, but the precious fellowship of other days was gone forever. A hint of all this may be found in these final 6 verses. This promise that God would send Elijah, who had left the earth 400 years previously, was a promise which suggests that the age of the prophets is now felt to be over. When that Elijah appears, his business will be that of restoring the broken harmony. In the meanwhile, let the true followers of God keep the sacred law and await the unfolding of the purpose of the Almighty. The final words of inspiration by the mouth of the prophets tells the people, be faithful to God. There's a great blessing ahead. Okay. In my King James, at the end of this of course isn't in Scripture, but they wrote in the end of the prophets. So that was interesting. End of the prophecies, that was it. And there was the time when there was a famine in the land for the Word of God. Questions, comments? We finished. We studied all 12 of those prophets.
It would be interesting to know in the intertestamental. To me, it would be interesting to study that intertestamental period. Because you know that they still had people that came and spoke as prophets.
Yeah.
They killed them. We know Jesus talks about they killed the prophets. I think that he's referring to that intertestamental period as well as the history of the false prophets. The Jews have to have history of that.
Yeah. Well, Gamaliel in Acts 5 talked about Judas and Theudas who came along. People were following them and they got killed and then their groups dispersed. So they died and their groups dispersed. So, in fact, even in Matthew 24, when Jesus was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, he even said that there were going to be false Christs who come along. And so you can imagine, look in our day and time, look over the last, just my lifetime. And those who are out there trying to decipher all these Old Testament prophecies and make something out of them that never was there in the first place. and trying to point to say, well, yes, this one is going to rise, this one is going to rise. And yet, more often than not today, it's not them saying this one's going to be the Messiah, as it is trying to identify what they call the Battle of Armageddon, or the mark of the beast, or the Antichrist, and something like that, and busily trying to identify all these things. Whereas the Bible is very simple in comparison to what man has manufactured. These prophecies were pointing toward Jesus Christ. They were pointing toward the end of one system, one covenant, the beginning of a new covenant.
Something that came to my mind when we were reading an earlier passage was right along those lines. When you read the part regarding the calf, we will go out and leap like calves released from the stall.
Mm-hmm.
It makes me think about, again, the analogy of the old law, very oppressive, very demanding, and, God set it out, but he didn't intend for them to add to it many more sub-laws that weren't even his initial concept. And it became very arduous and impossible for anyone to keep. And it makes me think about the law of liberty that Christ brought. And these calves are leaping for joy coming out of the stall. It almost kind of, to me, has a certain symbolism of that law of liberty. And it's, of course, not that we just do whatever in the world we think about doing, but that we're supposed to be motivated by love, and we're motivated by love to God as well as our fellow man to do what's right. But it's a joyful thing.
But in Galatians 5 deals with that in detail, where he talks about freedom in Christ. And then, of course, he goes on and says, don't use your liberty as an occasion to the flesh, as an excuse to do whatever you want to do. But, basically in that context, he is saying you're free from those Mosaic constraints.
As opposed to the image you have of full-grown cows under the yoke.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just like the little calf going out and skip. In fact, the New American Standard says skipping.
Mm-hmm.
I'm free. I'm going to go bounce around the field here for a while.
Well, it made me smile when you think of we had some cattle, and the ones that were out in the field, I mean, sure, they didn't run away from you, but they weren't just going to come into you. Where the calves, the cows that were in the barn, whenever you came in the barn, here they came right up to the door. They wanted to see you. They wanted some attention. So it made me think of, that we just get turned loose in the field. It's harder to reel us in. We do what we want to do. Where is it? If we stay in, think of Job. I stay in those walls, then I'm more happy to, in the aspect of spirituality, I'm more happy to be in the presence of God and doing the things that God wants.
I love that we're called cows and sheep.
Yeah.
But
in our society, that is not good. If you refer to yourself as a sheep, well, in our society, that's a bad thing.
Yeah.
You're just a follower. That's no good. But for us, it's an honor.
That's what we want to be. And the sheep is not a very bright animal, and present company included in that. I'm not a very bright individual, because just like that sheep, I need somebody to guide me, and I need to be disciplined. I need the rod and the staff. Exactly what they needed.
I think there's no better name we could be known by, though, than as to be a sheep of his pasture.
Yeah, we're a sheep, and he's the good shepherd.
Don't be a goat.
Right.
Goat is greatest of all time nowadays. That's what that stands for. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. And again, Tess, I'll get those out tonight, and we'll take them back from you by next Monday night. Great. Thank you very much.
We did it.